We're all living with these incredible devices in our pockets, constantly sending and receiving signals. For this deep dive, you shared some really interesting research asking a fundamental question. When scientists study the radiation from our mobile phones in the lab, is that actually telling us what's happening with the phones we use every single day?
Exactly.
We're looking specifically at a review article that really digs into how the radiation studied in experiments compares to, well, the real stuff.
That's right. The core issue this article brings up is whether the neat, controlled electromagnetic fields researchers often use are a true reflection of the messy, ever-changing radiation that comes out of our actual mobile phones.
Mhm.
Our goal today is to really understand those differences for you and, why that distinction could be so important when we're thinking about potential effects on our biology.
Okay, so the article jumps right into this central point. Should scientists be studying the complex radiation from the phones you and I use? Or is it sufficient to rely on these more predictable simulated signals in the lab? It might sound like a minor technicality, but this article argues it could be anything but.
Absolutely. And the foundation of their argument lies in a crucial difference.
Yeah.
The emissions from a real mobile phone when you're on a call, downloading data, or even just when it's connected to the network, they're dynamic.
Yeah.
They're constantly shifting.
Right. The article gives a bunch of examples that probably ring true for anyone who's ever used a phone. Things like how many bars of signal you have at any given moment,
Mhm.
how many other people are trying to use the same cell tower, even if you're walking around. But it's not just the strength going up and down, is it?
Precisely. The frequency and the very shape of those electromagnetic waves are in constant, unpredictable flux. Think about when you're speaking, your phone is working to transmit your voice efficiently. That's a different kind of signal than when you're just, say, browsing a website.
Okay.
And as mobile technology has evolved from 2G to 3G to 4G and now 5G, these signals have become increasingly intricate and, well, much less stable.
So, on one side, we have this real, constantly morphing electromagnetic environment around our actual phones.
Yeah.
And on the other, in a lab, you often have these very stable, precisely controlled signals. It's almost like trying to understand how a sailboat handles in a real ocean
hmm
with its unpredictable waves and winds versus testing a toy boat in a perfectly still bathtub.
That's a very insightful way to put it. And the article's central idea is that this inherent variability in real-world emissions might be what makes them more likely to interact with our biology.
Oh, okay.
This is where things get really interesting for you.
Okay, tell me more. Why would all this constant changing and fluctuation have a bigger impact on us?
Well, the article touches on how living things generally adapt to stresses in their surroundings. Over long periods, we've developed some defenses against natural electromagnetic variations, like those that happen during solar flares.
Right, natural background radiation.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But these artificial EMFs from our devices are a relatively new phenomenon in evolutionary terms. Our cells haven't specifically geared up to deal with this particular kind of stress.
That makes sense. It's like our bodies have general ways of responding to things that are off, but not necessarily a specific defense system for mobile phone radiation.
Exactly. The article points out that when cells are exposed to these artificial EMFs, they often activate heat shock genes and produce heat shock proteins quite rapidly, sometimes even more intensely than they do when exposed to actual heat.
Wow.
And studies on insect reproductive cells have shown higher rates of DNA damage from mobile phone radiation compared to other types of stress, like lack of food or certain chemicals. This hints at a particular sensitivity to these EMFs.
So our cells react strongly, but they might not be well equipped to handle this specific type of ongoing artificial stress.
That's part of it. The article also raises the point that organisms tend to adapt more readily to stressors that are constant or that change in predictable ways. Think of a steady background noise. You might eventually tune it out, right?
Yeah, you get used to it.
But if the noise is constantly fluctuating in volume and pitch, it's much harder to ignore and can be more disruptive.
And that brings us back to the highly variable nature of real mobile phone emissions. Because they're constantly changing, our biological systems might find it harder to get used to them compared to the stable signals used in many lab experiments.
Precisely. And here's another layer. The article mentions that pulsed or modulated signals, which are characteristic of how mobile phones transmit information,
Uh-huh.
are generally found to be more biologically active than continuous signals. Intermittent exposure, where the signal goes on and off, can be even more so.
Okay.
These patterns of variation seem to amplify biological responses. What's particularly noteworthy is that mobile phone signals use extremely low frequencies, or ELF, for modulation. Think of these as subtle vibrations layered onto the main radio wave.
Right, I've heard about ELF.
And these ELF frequencies themselves have been implicated in various biological effects.
So it's not just the main microwave frequency of the phone that might be interacting with our bodies, but also these lower frequency components embedded in the signal, and those are also shifting in real-world use.
Exactly. This complex interplay of constantly varying frequencies and intensities is a real challenge to replicate accurately with a simple fixed parameter signal generator in a lab setting.
This leads to a really interesting conflict highlighted in the article. The debate over whether to use real phones or these simulated signals in research. Apparently, some pretty influential organizations have weighed in on this.
Yes, the article notes that in the past, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IRC,
Mm.
and the Health Protection Agency, or HPA, have expressed reservations about studies using actual commercially available mobile phones.
Sorry.
Their primary concern revolved around what they termed unreliable dosimetry and high variability.
Ah, dosimetry. Measuring the dose.
Right. They argued that because the signal from a real phone changes so much due to network conditions and even the movement of whatever's being tested, it's difficult to precisely measure the exposure. Therefore, they recommended using devices with stable, fixed parameters to achieve better experimental control.
Okay, from a purely scientific standpoint, wanting controlled variables makes total sense. But then the article presents a pretty significant counterargument, right?
It does. The authors pose a very direct and compelling question for you to consider. Billions of people are exposed to these real variable emissions every single day. If that's the reality of exposure, does it truly make scientific sense to study the potential effects of that variable field using fixed, simplified conditions? Their answer is a firm no, especially if, as they suspect, that variability is a key factor in how these emissions interact with biological systems.
It's like trying to figure out how a certain type of food affects your digestion by only studying its individual components in isolation, rather than seeing how your body reacts to eating the actual meal. You might miss some crucial interactions.
That's an excellent analogy. And the article then delves into the findings of studies that have actually used real commercially available mobile phones in their experiments.
Yeah.
And the results are quite striking.
This is where a key insight for you really jumps out. The article points out that an overwhelming majority, I'm talking almost 96% of these studies using real-world phone emissions, reported significant adverse biological or clinical effects.
Wow.
That's a really high percentage.
It is indeed. Out of 48 studies that used real mobile phones in an active connection mode, meaning during talk, listen, or an active call,
Right.
0.46 of them found significant negative effects across a diverse range of biological samples. They looked at everything from fruit flies and ants to chicken eggs, human sperm, human volunteers, mice, and even bees.
That's a really wide range of organisms. And what kinds of problems did these studies observe? It sounds like a pretty broad spectrum of effects.
It was. The article details several. Loss of orientation in animals, changes in their activity levels and behavior, alterations in brainwave patterns measured by EEG, reduced reproductive capacity, changes at the molecular level within cells, altered enzyme activity, DNA damage, cell death, and even visible changes in brain tissue.
That's quite a list.
It is. And interestingly, they also noted that the talk mode, where your voice is being actively transmitted, appeared to be more biologically active than just the listen mode,
Why is that?
likely due to the higher intensity of emissions when the phone is actively transmitting your voice compared to just receiving.
That makes intuitive sense. The phone's probably working harder when it's actively sending out your voice. But still, that's a pretty concerning list of effects from using real phones in these studies. Were there any studies in that group that didn't find anything?
The article mentions only 2 out of those 48 studies that didn't report adverse effects. One found no effect at all, and the other reported an increase in short-term memory in children, which the authors didn't classify as negative, though they do acknowledge it still indicates a biological effect.
Right. An effect is still an effect.
Exactly. So the consistency of finding adverse effects with real phone emissions is quite remarkable.
Now, how does this compare to the research that uses these simulated signals? Because that seems to be the more common approach in lab studies, right?
It has been. And the article highlights a significant contrast. They state that over half, more than 50% of the studies that use simulated signals reported finding no effects at all.
Over half found nothing.
That's what they report.
Yeah.
Now, they do acknowledge that some broader reviews of the literature suggest an overall trend of finding some effects, regardless of whether the exposure was real or simulated.
Okay.
However, they also point to a meta-analysis, a study that combines the results of many other studies that look specifically at genetic damage, genotoxicity, in human cells from radiofrequency radiation.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of the studies included in that meta-analysis used simulated EMFs, and the overall conclusion was that there was no clear association with genetic damage.
So there seems to be a real split in the findings, depending on whether researchers are using the actual phones we use every day or these lab-created signals.
Definitely.
Studies using real phone emissions are much more likely to find negative effects compared to those using simulated signals.
That's the crux of the issue. The authors emphasize this strong conflict between the results of the two types of studies and the impressive consistency of effects in the real exposure studies. And they argue that this consistent pattern of findings shouldn't just be dismissed.
And it's not just what's happening in the lab, is it? The article also touches on some evidence from the real world that seems to align with the findings of these real exposure experiments.
Exactly. They highlight increasing epidemiological studies looking at patterns in populations that suggest a link between real-life mobile phone use and the development of brain tumors. They also mentioned statistical studies that have reported symptoms of ill health, like headaches or fatigue, among people living near mobile phone base stations or who are heavy mobile phone users themselves.
Okay.
And perhaps most concerning from an environmental standpoint, they cite open field studies that have documented declines in bird and amphibian populations in areas surrounding mobile phone base station antennas.
So you've got this convergence of evidence, lab studies using real phones showing effects, and some real-world data hinting at similar outcomes.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder why the simulated studies, which often show no effects, seem to carry so much weight when it comes to setting safety guidelines.
That brings us back to the concerns about unreliable dosimetry in the real exposure studies.
Right.
The argument has been that because the signal is variable, it's hard to know precisely how much radiation the test subjects are actually receiving. However, the authors of this review directly address that criticism.
How do they counter that? Because it does seem like a valid point. If you can't accurately measure the exposure, it's tough to draw firm conclusions about the effects.
They make a few key points. First, while many real exposure studies do place the biological samples very close to the phone in what's called the near field, where the signal is most complex and intense,
Uh-huh.
a significant number of studies have exposed samples at greater distances in the far field, up to a meter away.
Okay.
In the far field, the intensity variations are much less pronounced, and the methods for measuring the exposure, the dosimetry, are generally well established and considered reliable.
So it can be measured reliably in some cases.
Yes. And interestingly, they even point to one study where DNA damage was found to be more significant at a distance of 20-30 centimeters than right next to the phone.
That's surprising. You'd naturally assume the closer you are, the stronger the effect would be.
It is counterintuitive and highlights the complexity of these interactions, doesn't it? The article also briefly explains the concept of the near field, which is a distance that depends on the frequency of the radiation. For the frequencies commonly used in 2G mobile phones, like 900 or 1800 megahertz, the near field extends only a few centimeters. Beyond that is the far field.
Okay, so some real exposure studies are indeed being conducted under conditions where the exposure can be measured with reasonable accuracy. What about the inherent variability of the signal itself? How do they address that concern?
The authors argue that even with the variability, studies that have looked at the relationship between the amount of exposure and the resulting effects, what we call dose-response relationships, in real mobile phone emissions, have generally found that the effects do depend on the dose.
Meaning more exposure, more effect, or is it more complex?
It often means the intensity and/or duration of exposure matters, but the relationships aren't always linear. Sometimes you see effects at lower intensities that disappear at higher ones, or vice versa. It's complex. But the point is, they are finding dose-dependent effects. And while the precise characteristics of the signal will differ between individual exposures in the real world, the average strength of the field over a short period tends to be quite consistent.
Right.
This leads to qualitatively similar results when experiments are repeated. By conducting more repetitions and carefully controlling other factors in the experiment, researchers can still achieve statistical significance and account for that natural variability.
So their argument is that the variability doesn't necessarily invalidate the data, it just requires careful experimental design and analysis. You need more replicates, basically.
Exactly. And this leads them to their main conclusions and recommendations, which are quite strong and have significant implications for you, the listener.
I can imagine. So what are the key takeaways the authors want us to have?
Their primary conclusion is that the significant variability of real mobile phone EMFs is the most likely reason why we see such different results between studies using real exposures and those using simulated ones.
Yeah.
They argue that the tendency of health agencies to dismiss real exposure studies due to concerns about variability is a real problem, especially considering the consistent adverse findings and the potential need for much stricter exposure limits.
So by focusing on this idea of unreliable dosimetry, are the health agencies potentially overlooking a crucial aspect of how these emissions actually affect us, that variability itself?
That's precisely their concern. They suggest that instead of dismissing these studies, researchers should be encouraged to include detailed measurements of both the radio frequency and the extremely low frequency ELF components of the emissions in their real phone studies.
Measure both parts.
Yes, this would involve reporting the average intensity along with the standard deviation to give a better picture of the real-world exposure, in addition to the specific absorption rate, or SAR, values provided by manufacturers.
That sounds like a sensible middle ground, acknowledging the variability while still striving to quantify the exposure as best as possible.
But they take it a step further. They raise a very thought-provoking point for you to consider. If the real EMFs emitted by commercially available mobile phones are deemed so variable and their measurements so unreliable that studies using them are dismissed, then should we really be so confident in having approved these devices for widespread public use in the first place? After all, people are constantly exposed to this unknown variable signal.
That's a really powerful point that makes you think. It shifts the focus back to the regulators and the initial approval process. If it's too messy to study, maybe it's too messy to use.
That's the implication. The authors believe that simply defining the exposure as using a commercially available phone during a typical conversation should be sufficient for these studies to be taken seriously. They view the continued reliance on non-realistic simulations when real-world conditions can be studied in the lab as a serious scientific flaw that is pervasive in this field of research.
So they're essentially calling for a major change in how this kind of research is conducted. Stop relying so heavily on the simplified models.
Absolutely. They're urging for urgent experiments that directly compare the biological activity of real versus simulated EMFs while ensuring that the average parameters of the exposure are similar.
A head-to-head comparison.
Exactly. They also suggest repeating some of these simulated exposure studies that found no effects, but this time using actual mobile phone exposures to see if the results differ.
And what are their recommendations regarding the current safety guidelines? Where do they think this leaves us?
They are quite direct on this point. Based on the consistent findings of the real exposure studies, they recommend that health agencies should immediately reconsider their current guidelines and apply the precautionary principle,
Meaning?
meaning taking action to prevent potential harm even if the scientific evidence isn't yet fully conclusive. They suggest drastically lowering the existing exposure limits, emphasizing that effects are being observed in these real exposure studies at intensity levels far, far below the current safety standards.
So, by primarily relying on studies that often use these simplified and perhaps less biologically active simulated signals, we might be significantly underestimating the actual risks to public health.
That's the core of their concern. They conclude by strongly recommending that biological and clinical studies investigating the potential health effects of mobile phone radiation should prioritize the use of real EMFs from commercially available devices to more accurately reflect the conditions of real-life exposure.
Makes sense.
While simulated emissions might still have a role to play in studying specific parameters in a controlled way, they should not be seen as a replacement for understanding the effects of the actual devices we use every day.
This really highlights a potentially significant gap between how we study mobile phone radiation in controlled lab settings and what's actually happening when we're using these devices in our daily lives. It definitely makes you question some of the conclusions that have been reached about their safety.
Indeed. As our scientific understanding of how electromagnetic fields interact with biological systems continues to evolve, the authors argue that our experimental approaches need to become more sophisticated and truly reflect the reality of our exposures.
Yeah.
And a crucial step in that direction is embracing the study of real-life emissions from the devices we use.
Taking this deep dive into this review has really made me think differently about mobile phone radiation. It's not just about how strong the signal is on average, but also about this constant and complex variability. That seems key.
Exactly. To truly understand the potential biological and health implications of a technology that billions of people use daily, shouldn't our research focus on studying that technology in its real-world operating conditions,
Yeah,
rather than a simplified approximation?
seems logical.
The authors certainly believe so, and they present a compelling argument that sticking with unrealistic simulations could lead to seriously flawed conclusions with significant consequences for public health.
So, bringing it back to you, the listener, this deep dive into the review article reveals a really critical point. The way mobile phone radiation is frequently studied in laboratories, using simulated signals, might not accurately represent the complex and highly variable emissions we encounter in our daily lives.
Uh-huh.
And this difference, according to the authors, could be a major reason why we see such conflicting results in the scientific literature.
And this raises a crucial question for you to ponder. Given this evidence suggesting that the ever-changing nature of real-world mobile phone emissions might make them more biologically active than the stable signals often used in labs, what are the broader implications? Or
Right.
implications for future research, for the public health guidelines that are in place, and even for how we ourselves use mobile technology in our daily lives? Are we potentially underestimating certain risks by placing so much emphasis on these simplified laboratory models?
It certainly gives you a lot to consider. Maybe it's worth digging a little deeper into some of these real exposure studies or taking another look at the current safety guidelines with this new information in mind.
Yeah.
It definitely feels like this is an area where our scientific understanding is still very much unfolding. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.